Hermann Göring walked through the marble halls of his estate, Hall, with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been truly wrong, or at least from surrounding yourself with people who never told you that you were. He was a large man in every sense. Large in body, large in appetite, large in certainty. His uniforms were custom-made because no standard uniform could contain both his ambition and his girth. He collected paintings the way other men collected stamps, enthusiastically, relentlessly, and without much concern for who had owned them before. He loved fine food, expensive wine, and the sound of his own voice making promises. And he had made one promise above all others. No enemy aircraft would fly over German soil. He had said it out loud. He had said it to Hitler. He had said it to the German people. He had placed his entire reputation, which was considerable, because in the early years of the war, his reputation was one of the most powerful things in Germany, on this single guarantee. The Luftwaffe was his. He had built it. He had shaped it. He had watched it tear through Poland and France and the skies over Britain with a satisfaction that felt almost physical. His pilots were the best in the world. His aircraft were the finest machines human engineering had produced. He believed this the way deeply religious people believe in God, not as an opinion, but as a structural fact of the universe. He was about to learn what happens when a structural fact turns out to be a personal one. The year was 1944, and the war had shifted in ways that official reports tried very hard to obscure and that Göring tried even harder not to look at directly. The Eastern Front had devoured resources that were supposed to last a decade. Stalingrad had happened, a word that, in German military circles, had stopped being a place and become a feeling. The feeling of a door closing behind you in a very cold room. American forces had landed in North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, moving slowly but with the unhurried confidence of people who have unlimited tanks and do not particularly mind how long things take. And now the Americans were sending their heavy bombers, the B-17 flying fortresses, north and east, deeper into Europe, dropping bombs on German factories and oil refineries and rail yards with increasing regularity. This bothered Göring, but not completely. Because the bombers came without fighters. This was not an oversight. It was a mathematical reality, and Göring understood mathematics well enough to find comfort in it. Fighter aircraft consumed fuel at a rate that placed hard limits on how far they could fly. The distances between England and the industrial heart of Germany were simply too great. A fighter that escorted bombers all the way to a German target would arrive with empty tanks and no way home. So the bombers came alone, and the Luftwaffe's interceptors met them with enthusiasm, and the losses among American bomber crews were devastating. Men climbed into those aircraft knowing the odds in ways that required a particular kind of courage to process without going mad. Göring called the bombers brave and stupid. He called them, privately, easy. He should have paid more attention to the men working in a factory in California. The P-51 Mustang had been born out of necessity and then accidentally transformed into something extraordinary. North American aviation had built the first version quickly, dangerously quickly, the kind of quickly that usually produces aircraft that fall apart or catch fire or simply refuse to fly in the directions you point them. The British had needed fighters, and North American had delivered a prototype in 117 days, which is the aviation equivalent of writing a novel over a long weekend. The early Mustangs were decent aircraft with a significant problem. Their Allison engines, which worked reasonably well at low altitudes, began struggling badly when they climbed higher. At the altitudes where real combat happened, where bombers flew and interceptors hunted, the early P-51 was, to use a precise technical term, disappointing. Then someone had the idea of fitting a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine into the airframe. This is one of those moments in engineering history where the solution is so obvious in retrospect that it seems almost embarrassing that it took as long as it did. The Merlin engine powered the Spitfire. It powered the Hurricane. It was, by the standards of the time, a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, a 12-cylinder monster that produced more power per displacement than almost anything else in the air. Inside the P-51's lighter, more aerodynamically refined airframe, it did something remarkable. It produced an aircraft that could do everything. It was fast enough to chase German fighters and agile enough to fight them when it caught them. It had a bubble canopy that gave its pilot nearly unobstructed vision in every direction, which sounds like a small thing until you understand that in aerial combat, the pilot who sees first almost always wins. It was stable enough to fly long distances without exhausting the men at the controls. And it had range. That was the thing. That was the whole terrible, war-changing, promise-breaking thing. The P-51D, fitted with external drop tanks, additional fuel pods attached beneath the wings that could be jettisoned before combat, could fly from airfields in England to Berlin and back. The math that Göring had relied on, the comfortable arithmetic of distance and fuel consumption that had assured him the bombers would always come unescorted, had been quietly solved by a group of engineers who did not particularly care about the assumptions of the Reichsmarshal. The first time German interceptor pilots encountered Mustangs deep over German territory, there was a period of genuine confusion. These pilots were experienced men. Many of them had been flying combat since 1939. They had fought over Poland and France and Britain and the Mediterranean and the vast, punishing distances of the Eastern Front. They knew what American aircraft looked like. They knew the P-47 Thunderbolt, which was a large, powerful aircraft that could escort bombers partway into Germany before turning back. They knew the P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design, which could reach somewhat further. But Mustangs over Berlin? Mustangs over the industrial centers of the Ruhr Valley? Mustangs appearing, sleek and maneuverable and full of fuel, precisely where no fighter was supposed to be able to reach. It required a moment of recalibration. The recalibration, for the German pilots, was not pleasant. Because the P-51 did not merely appear in places where no fighter had appeared before. It fought with aggressive confidence. American pilots, trained in large numbers and equipped with aircraft that were now genuinely competitive with the best German fighters, engaged the Luftwaffe's interceptors with increasing effectiveness. The numerical balance was shifting in ways that those early encounters made viscerally clear. Germany was running out of experienced pilots faster than it was producing new ones. America was not running out of anything. Göring heard the reports. He was not a stupid man, which made the situation in some ways worse. A stupid man can dismiss reports that contradict his beliefs. An intelligent man who has built his entire identity on those beliefs faces a more complicated problem. He has to watch his certainty erode piece by piece, and he has to find someone to blame for each piece, because the alternative, acknowledging that the foundational promise was wrong, is not something he is equipped to do. He blamed the pilots. This was the response that history would record and that the Luftwaffe's surviving officers would discuss for decades afterward with a combination of bitterness and disbelief. Göring, standing before men who had risked their lives in aircraft that were increasingly outclassed against increasingly numerous opponents, told them they were cowards. He accused decorated aces, men with hundreds of kills, men who had flown more combat hours than he would ever understand from the inside of a cockpit, of exaggerating enemy strength to excuse their own failures. The pilots, who could not exactly argue with the Reichsmarshal without serious personal consequences, endured this. Some of them, privately, said things about Göring that would have been spectacular to hear. But the reports kept coming. The Mustangs kept appearing. And the factories kept burning. There came a day, accounts vary slightly on the precise moment, but the substance is consistent across multiple sources, when Göring was briefed on yet another American escort fighter sighting. This time, the location was not the edges of German territory, not the borderlands where a determined pilot with a large fuel tank might theoretically push his range to the limit. The location was Berlin. American fighters, small and fast and unmistakably P-51s, had been observed over the German capital. Göring's response to this information has been quoted and paraphrased in various ways across various historical accounts, but the emotional core of it is always the same. He said, in effect, that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he understood the war was lost. The phrasing that has come down through history, sometimes translated slightly differently, always carrying the same weight, was something like, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." This is a remarkable statement. Not because it was wrong, it was absolutely correct, and the ability to recognize catastrophic strategic reality clearly is actually a form of intelligence, but because of what it meant for a man whose entire public identity rested on the opposite claim. He had promised the German people that no enemy plane would touch German soil. A P-51 Mustang was flying over their capital city. The promise was not late. It was not qualified. It was not technically accurate if you read it carefully. It was simply broken. What happened in the air war over Germany after that recognition was not a sudden collapse. It was something slower and, in many ways, more merciless. The Americans pressed their advantage with the systematic thoroughness of people who had converted their enormous industrial economy to war production and were now delivering the results of that conversion in large quantities at high altitude. The bomber streams grew larger. The fighter escorts grew more numerous. The targets were chosen with increasing precision, oil refineries, specifically, because aircraft need fuel and tanks need fuel and trucks need fuel, and an army that runs out of fuel stops moving. Germany started running out of fuel. The Luftwaffe's response was to throw everything it had at the problem, which accelerated the depletion of its most irreplaceable resource, experienced pilots. A P-51 pilot who was shot down over Germany might survive, become a prisoner of war, and eventually go home. A German pilot shot down over Germany might also survive, but he was needed immediately in another aircraft, and the pool of pilots capable of surviving such engagements was shrinking faster than training could replenish it. New German pilots were being sent into combat with fewer and fewer flight hours, against opponents who were well-trained, well-equipped, and arriving in numbers that made individual courage increasingly irrelevant. This is one of the harder truths of industrial war. It is not always won by the bravest. It is often won by the side that can afford to keep replacing what it loses. Göring retreated, in some sense, into himself. He continued to hold his titles. He remained Reichsmarschall. He remained, officially, commander of the Luftwaffe. But the real decisions were increasingly made by men with more influence over Hitler and less baggage in the form of promises that had already been publicly broken. He spent time at Carenhall, his massive estate north of Berlin, surrounded by art he had collected and food he enjoyed and a version of reality that he found more comfortable than the one playing out in the skies overhead. He became, in the internal politics of the Nazi regime, a diminishing figure, still loud, still present, still capable of fury when confronted with news he disliked, but no longer the second man in Germany. Hitler, who had his own complicated relationship with reality, tolerated Göring's failures in ways that were perhaps less about affection than about the difficulty of admitting that the men he had promoted so extravagantly had been built on a foundation that could not hold. There were arguments. There were confrontations. There were moments of brutal clarity followed by long stretches of willful ignorance. The war went on. By the time the war reached its final stages, the skies over Germany were effectively American and British. The Luftwaffe still flew, some of its pilots performed acts of extraordinary courage against overwhelming odds right to the very end, but the strategic air battle had been decided. The P-51 Mustang had not done this alone. It had done it in combination with the industrial capacity of a country that could produce aircraft and pilots in quantities that Germany could not match, in combination with the courage of American bomber crews who had flown those early, unescorted missions when the losses were devastating, and in combination with the decisions made at every level of the Allied command about where to direct that capacity and those crews. But the Mustang had been the unlock. The specific, technical, elegant solution to the one problem that had kept Germany's skies safe. Range. Not courage. Not numbers, at first. Just the cold engineering fact of how far a single aircraft could fly on a tank of fuel and a pair of drop tanks that could be thrown away when they were empty. Hermann Göring stood trial at Nuremberg after the war ended. He did not go quietly. He was, even in defeat, even standing before an international tribunal that was documenting the full scale of the horrors carried out under the government he had served, a figure of considerable theatrical presence. He argued with prosecutors. He corrected the translations of his own words. He defended decisions with a fluency that sometimes impressed and more often appalled the people watching. He was found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and sentenced to death by hanging. He was not hanged. The night before his scheduled execution, he bit down on a cyanide capsule he had somehow kept hidden through 2 years of captivity and tribunal proceedings, and he died on his own terms, in his cell, in the early hours of October 16, 1946. Even at the very end, he found a way to choose the manner of his exit. It was, in a strange way, consistent with the man. He had always preferred his own version of events to anyone else's. He had always chosen the story he wanted to be inside, even when the facts outside that story were impossible to ignore. But the facts had mattered. They had mattered in the air over Berlin in 1944, when a small, single-engine American fighter appeared at an altitude and a distance that Göring's arithmetic had declared impossible. They had mattered to the German pilots who flew against that fighter and recognized, with the clarity that comes from sitting inside a cockpit while someone better equipped tries to kill you, that something had changed. They had mattered to the bomber crews who had been dying in large numbers and who, with the arrival of escort fighters that could actually stay with them, began to survive in larger numbers and reach their targets with greater consistency. They had mattered to the factory workers and the oil refinery employees and the rail yard supervisors who watched American bombs land with increasing accuracy and frequency and understood, in the immediate and personal way that people understand things when the building next to them is on fire, that the air above Germany was no longer German. The P-51 Mustang flew in combat for the rest of the war in Europe without losing its status as the finest long-range escort fighter in the conflict. After the war, it continued flying, continued serving, remained in production and active use in various air forces around the world for years. It was not a glamorous story in the traditional sense. It did not involve a single dramatic battle or a single pilot whose name became famous. It was a story about engineering, about a decision to try a different engine in an existing airframe, about the mathematics of fuel consumption and aircraft range, about the specific consequences of solving a specific problem. But the consequences had been enormous. One aircraft, redesigned around one engine, fitted with external fuel tanks that made a number impossible to dismiss. A promise broken over Berlin. A man who was smart enough to understand what he was seeing, experienced enough to know what it meant, and too invested in his own certainty to have seen it coming. And the long, cold, inevitable logic of a war that turned on whether a fighter could stay in the air long enough to cross a border and come back. It could. That was the whole thing, really. It could.